Welcome to week 4, and I am open to module 7. We will have 3 modules this week, so the middle of the whole 6-week session for summer is a little bit more heavy than the beginning and the end. So in your last 2 weeks, you'll only have 2 modules for each week. So for this week, week 4, we have modules 7, 8, and 9. Module 7 is going to cover Chapter 8, which is nutrition, weight control, diet, exercise, and safety. It also corresponds with Chapter 8 in the Longevity Project. So those are going to be your focus on readings for the week. In terms of the objectives for Chapter 8, I've got them here. You'll also be covering the digestive system, which is Module 3 within Chapter 2 of Serafino and Smith. So the digestive system goes nicely with this chapter because in this chapter we're talking a lot about the effects of our diet and how our body responds to our diet, and a lot of that response comes from our digestive system. However, we'll also be looking at the cardiovascular system, which we've already covered in previous weeks. So you'll be kind of going back to some of that which you learned when we covered that physiological system. So first off, for Chapter 8, we'll be taking a look at diabetes and its effect on health. What are some of the outcomes of individuals who have diabetes? And also just distinguishing between the two different types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, and why diabetes is such an issue in terms of adherence. People having a tough time to understand their regimen, a tough time adhering to their regimen, following the medical advice of their doctors, specifically when it comes to diet is the hardest for the diabetic. So there's a lot that's involved in a person's self-management of diabetes. And so you'll be taking a look at some of what those elements are and some different factors that come into play as an individual's kind of making decisions daily on diet and exercise and then how that affects their diabetes. We'll also be looking at some of the psychosocial factors in the care of diabetes. We see that people cope very differently with the disease depending upon where they are stationed in life. So we take a look at how children and adolescents respond to diabetes versus middle-aged or older individuals that are diabetics, and just why it is so hard for people to cope with diabetes. There's so many different psychosocial elements, like the environment that the person's living in, their social support system, which we just learned a lot about, and what that looks like, nutrition in the home, eating patterns in the home, and those kinds of things. So take a lot of look at that. We'll also be looking at the basic components of food, what the basic food groups are. This is where we get into like the basics of nutrition. So this is very much more of a heavy emphasis on the health aspect of this class. Looking at what people are eating versus what they should be eating. So we get very specific there. We'll look at a lot of statistics on the American diet today versus what it used to be and versus what it needs to be in order for us to live healthier, longer lives. We'll also be looking at what the public response has been to mass media campaigns to eat healthier. It's not great. We see a lot of documentaries out today. In fact, you can just go onto Netflix and you can catch a whole bunch of different documentaries on eating trends, diet trends, the role of the media in our diet and how much it affects us, what's promoted, and fast food chains and all of that. But there really is a lot of different media effects that take a toll on our diet and the way that we eat and the patterns that we develop. So look a little bit at that. And then we'll get into the specifics of diet and how it affects us in terms of disease. So the few that we'll be taking kind of a closer look at are atherosclerosis, hypertension, and cancer. Those are kind of like the big three. Heart disease is the number one killer in the U.S. And so when something is taking lives and it's something that can be prevented, we take it very seriously. And that's where the role of a health psychologist really comes into play in promoting health. How do we promote healthier diets? How do we get people to buy into that? How do we get people to understand the importance of setting up healthy habits and healthy patterns early in life? Because if we don't, the flip side is disease. And all of these diseases, for the most part, are very preventable. These are diseases due to a lifetime of poor eating habits and lack of activity, exercise, a sedentary lifestyle. So specifically, we'll look at the elements of atherosclerosis as well as heart disease, clogging of the arteries. How does that mechanically happen? So the physiology of it, the role of cholesterol and lipoproteins, as well as other elements in our diet like trans fats and LDL. We'll be breaking down all of the different contributors that lead to the hardening of our arteries over time. Also look at definitions of how we today calculate when an individual is overweight or is categorized as obese. How do we measure that? How do we know? How do we gauge that? And then taking a look at the sociocultural aspects that feed into the obesity cycle. There are a lot of things that are linked to obesity, like age, gender, race, and SES. Obesity is not equal across all of those platforms, all of those demographics. We see pockets where certain people are suffering more with obesity. It has to do with heredity. There's a heredity role in it for sure, but even more so, psychosocial factors that are involved in weight control and how we as a society are contributing to the obesity epidemic, really. And then, obviously we want to talk about how we can prevent it. We understand and we know different strategies that work to prevent obesity. We just haven't really bought into it as a society and followed it through. So we'll also look at some different treatments for weight loss, kind of how do fad diets work, why do they often fail, the role of exercise, as well as behavioral and cognitive methods for weight control, the use of self-help groups, and different other medically supervised approaches that might be necessary if none of the behavioral methods can seem to work. We'll look at some different eating disorders very briefly, anorexia, bulimia, the origins of those and treatment, and then get into exercise. So the effects of exercise on our health, both psychologically and physiologically. Why is exercise lacking in today's society? Sometimes from an outward perspective, it would seem that we're very exercise conscious and focused, but yet the stats tell us otherwise. When 2/3 of our society is obese and even more overweight, we know by looking at those numbers that we're not exercising, or that very few in the population are doing that. So why is that the case? And how can we as a society promote exercise and overall healthier living that's attainable for more people? And then very briefly in the last part of the chapter, we'll look at some different factors like accidents and environmental hazards faced by people today. That's where the safety kind of end of it comes into play. So with the digestive system, really you're just looking at the physiological process that the body uses to break down and digest food, what can go wrong, what can go awry in this. So looking at some of the disorders particular to the digestive system and the basic mechanics of metabolism. Understanding what a calorie is, what is basal metabolic rate, how does it affect our bodies, and how does food also contribute to that process. So here are the lecture slides. I also have a video assignment that goes along with this chapter very nicely. It's a video on obesity called The Weight of Obesity. You can click here and access the video, and the worksheet assignment is right here. So you can open that up, you can type into it, it's a Word doc. So you can type your answers. Just remember that when you submit your assignment by clicking here, you're not attaching it as an attachment, you're just copy and pasting your answers directly in to the assignment box. So that assignment's worth 10 points. It's going to be due on the 31st. Would really be helpful to read the chapter before you watch the video so that you understand some of the basics here with diet and exercise before getting into the complexities that the video is going to talk about when it comes to obesity. It kind of tackles obesity from a psychosocial perspective. So all the different factors contributing to obesity, what are they, why do they exist, and how can we make them better? That's what the video is about. Your discussion is going to have to do with Chapter 8 of the Longevity Project, and of course you can definitely integrate in the Serafino and Smith chapter as well, because this week we're talking about physical activity. So this is the chapter where the termites were followed, obviously all of their life. And in this chapter, it talks about their exercise over their lifespans. What did that look like? Who fared well? The ones who were active, how did they do? The ones who were not active, how did they do? Some surprising findings, I think. But in the assessment that you're going to be taking for you, it's a little bit more complicated than previous assessments. You're going to be asked to write down activities that you do on a daily or weekly basis, and you're going to be asked to assign points to each activity based on pretty much how much metabolic activity you're expending. So you want to take a look at the assessment in the chapter, and it's going to explain to you how to give those points. You're basically going to have to think about the activities that you do and match them to some of the activities that the termites did. So you'll see that there's points for an activity like gardening or fishing. Many of you might not do those things, so what might be on par with gardening or fishing that you do in terms of energy expendage? Obviously CrossFit would not be the same as gardening. So you kind of want to find out what point value your activities are worth and go ahead and add them up that way. And then you're just going to be answering the questions about the termites in terms of how they did their exercise trajectory based on how they lived their lives. So that wraps up that module, and then we have 2 more coming up after that.